sponsoring this colloquium series and keeping this thing organized. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming. I'd like to just kind of start our conversation with some rather general comments on the topic of structural violence. I have 4 kind of remarks I'd like to go through. But I'd like us to think about violence in the broadest possible sense, right? So to begin with, I'd like us to think about the structural violence of the current global financial crisis. We're witnessing the full unraveling of modern financial capitalism, a global financial order that was largely constructed and underwritten by the United States to serve U.S. interests, right? And it finds itself in crisis in this moment, right? And the hundreds of billions of taxpayer dollars that the U.S. government is currently throwing at the situation are quite literally papering over a much more fundamental systemic catastrophe. A catastrophe that has rapidly encompassed the entire globe, and a catastrophe whose full effects I think we've only just yet begun to feel. And I believe these things will get much, much worse. But what the global economic downturn does reveal for us is the violence inherent in the predatory structure of late capitalism. And this violence operates on multiple levels. At the most basic material level, the world the bankers have made determines not only who lives and who dies, but how you live and how you die. Given the global economic meltdown, we're facing the prospect of long-term, if not permanent, decline in the standards of living for many people in the world. In a situation of tremendous global economic inequality, some 2/3 of the planet already live a rather precarious existence. The outcome of the global economic downturn cannot but be disastrous for this wide population. Rising food prices, global food shortages, the myriad effects of global warming, and the increasing geopolitical instability in many parts of the world certainly spell disaster for wide swaths of humanity. We've reached a point where the center simply cannot hold. At another level, this violence operates in the very ways in which we think, or the ways in which we're told to think about the economy, right? So it becomes something that stands apart and above from the ordinary workings of reality, right? Under the current sort of so-called bailout schemes, the prioritization of reinvigorating the credit markets is a symptom of this kind of magical thinking, right? The roots of the current crisis, right, lie in the basic structure of global finance: predatory lending, debt leveraging, unequal exchange, fictitious assets, and the creation of these artificially complex financial instruments that disguise what in other contexts would be called fraud or outright larceny. Even the way we discuss the nature of the problem serves to mask actual violence that's being perpetrated against the real economy. The simple fact is that when the rubber hits the road, there are people beneath the statistics, people beneath the spreadsheets trying to make a living, right? That is the real economy, right? People engaged in the course of production and reproduction, and not this kind of make-believe world of economists and hedge fund managers, right? The economy as abstraction serves the interest of financial capital. And the violence at this level resides in imagining an economy apart from the people who make it exist. This is what Oliver Cox called, back in the 1930s, the social pathology of the profit-making system. So that's the first thing I wanted us to come to. The second thing, this kind of brings us back to our good friend Lawrence Summers, who came up in this room last week. Along with believing that women do not have the aptitude for grasping higher mathematics or advanced science, in 1991, while serving as the chief economist for the World Bank, Summers authored a private memo arguing that the bank should actively encourage the dumping of toxic waste in the third world, particularly underpopulated countries in Africa, since, in his words, these areas were, and I quote, underpolluted. Now this is conceptual violence of the highest order, right? Yet it's completely understandable within the framework of neoliberal discourse and completely in keeping with the predatory logic of capital. A logic where the value of human life can be quantified and subject to cost-benefit analyses. Again, this is that social pathology Cox was talking about. Now, it's often been joked that for people of color the world over, it's always been the Great Depression. However, the depths of the current global crisis, the nature of which, again, we're only just beginning to see, are going to have profound ramifications for the third world. And within these communities, nations, and regions, the burden of this hardship is falling disproportionately on women of color. And I'm using third world deliberately for 2 reasons. On the one hand, I believe that the term developing countries or developing nations is at best dangerously euphemistic, and at worst, it serves to obscure the structural violence of development itself. We simply cannot refer to Zimbabwe or Afghanistan, for instance, as developing nations. Or if so, developing into what? Is the US a developing nation? Is Iceland? So again, I want to steer away from that terminology because I think it does obscure the violence of development. On the other hand, the term third world evokes a historical moment where the commonality of diverse struggles was being recognized, of course not unproblematically, but there was at least an awareness of the interlocking and interconnectedness of a variety of diverse movements. And I think in these dangerous times, it might serve as well to go back and re-examine some of the successes and some of the failures of the third world. So I use that word quite purposefully. And it also draws attention to the fact that the global economic crisis is a crisis of global economic inequality. This inequality is not accidental. It is a direct result of US foreign and domestic policy, from the structuring of the international trade, the operation of US and multinational corporations in the global south. The structural adjustment programs and austerity measures of the World Bank and the IMF reinforce the dependency of the third world, fiscal malstructuring, monetary imperialism, and oligarchic practice become the conditions for development aid. The economic philosophy of development is both violent and dysfunctional. Instead of promoting policies to make so-called better countries more self-reliant, the administrators of the World Bank demand that loan recipients pursue policies that deepen instability, and the terms of World Bank support have been such as to cripple the long-term viability of many governments, to underdevelop national economies, and to subsidize dependency through continued exploitation rather than financing self-sufficiency or self-sustainability. As has been said before, after the post-colonial would seem to come the neo-colonial. And again, the massive economic disparities and growing inequities have profound effects that are thoroughly racialized and thoroughly gendered. Women do 2/3 of all the world's work. In exchange, they receive 10% of all the income and own a mere 1% of the means of production. The afflicted world in which we live is characterized by a deeply unequal sharing of the burden of adversities between women and men. In the 21st century, we're witnessing the culmination of the long march of capitalist exploitation across the globe. And it's so obvious that it's easy to forget that at the dawn of our global economic system, some of the first goods for sale on the world market, some of the first commodities to be exchanged on an international scale were human beings. Which brings me to my third point. When we think about structural violence and the foundations of the capitalist system in relationship to the current economic predicament, a particularly graphic example of the pathological ways in which capital is playing itself out is the contemporary crisis in the Congo. Excuse me. Jennifer Winslow once wrote, "If the Congo did not exist, it would be necessary to invent it." Time and again, whatever natural resource became indispensable to European capitalist expansion and technological innovation was to be found in the Congo in vast stores. End quote. Beginning with slave labor in the 16th century, ivory in the 19th, after 1890 it was rubber for tires and electrical and telegraph insulation,